and welcome to a special edition of DNET, the Disability Network. I'm Bill McQueen. Until around 15 years ago, the federal government hadn't looked at issues that affect people with disabilities in much depth or in a coordinated way. Since then, they've made efforts to identify obstacles faced by people with disabilities. But now some people with disabilities feel they've been studied to death and are calling for more action. Today we'll take a look at progress which has or hasn't taken place. And we'll also hear what a panel from Halifax, Toronto, and Vancouver thinks we need in the area of federal government initiatives. The federal government only started looking seriously at disability issues in the late 70s and early 80s. One of the key mechanisms for monitoring progress has been the Parliamentary Committee on the Status of Disabled Persons. Neil Young served on the committee from its inception in 1980 until the last federal election. I spoke with him at a modern office building which has many accessible features. He says that before serving on the committee, most of the members didn't have any real exposure to the issues that people with disabilities face.
It was an eye-opener, I think, for all members of the committee, certainly for myself. And the more we got into the issue itself, I think the more dedicated the members became, the more determined the committee members became to try and get government to address some of these very serious issues.
Like everybody, I knew some disabled people, but had no idea of the issues and the problems and the challenges and the extent to which they were shut out of everyday life in many ways and didn't need to be.
David Smith was the chairman of the committee when it published the Obstacles Report in 1981.
I think we heard well over 600 witnesses in about 18 different cities over a period of several months, and then we came out with a report that was very revolutionary in terms of parliamentary committees because it was full of photographs. And what we did was we took a number of people and sort of tried to tell their life stories, and it made it come alive for people. And
the Obstacles Report was published in a magazine format so it would be easily readable and widely distributed.
We even made sure that we had a good number of people on the staff of that committee who had disabilities. So that it wasn't some kind of paternalistic group of able-bodied people who were telling disabled people what was good for them. We were actually listening to what disabled people told us. And they were very much in the forefront of ensuring that those recommendations were real recommendations that, if enacted, would address any concerns that they had. We did something else that no other committee had ever done, and that was that when we had the report completed and tabled in the House, that we actually took the report back to the people who had met during the committee hearings to explain the document to them, to discuss the document with them, to seek their political support for the recommendations in the document.
That report came out 14 years ago. In setting the context of the time, Obstacles stated, in comparison with the efforts being made in other countries, Canada shows poor progress in assisting disabled persons in the area of employment opportunities, income security, community support services, and technical aids. The members can find little reason for this situation other than lack of direction and coordination on the part of government, institutional, and community leaders who have the power to make changes. There are no insurmountable obstacles to prevent Canada from taking a world leadership role in providing disabled persons with the practical means for greater independence. What has happened since? Judith Snow is an advocate for the inclusion of people with disabilities. How effectively have the obstacles identified in the report been addressed?
What has clearly worked is a big emphasis on accessibility. And I don't mean that that's perfect by any means. I still won't get into the second floor of a lot of places, like stores and people's houses and so on and so on. But in terms of being able to get around, visit people, shop, that's much improved over the last 10 years. One of the ways I really like to point that out to people is the increase in skateboarding and rollerblading, like that. Those were sports that were minor when there weren't curb cuts accessibility has been great for everyone, not just those of us labeled disabled.
Curb cuts are an example of how things can improve, not only for people with disabilities, but for other members of society when an obstacle is identified and acted on, an action that takes political will.
But I think that that's about where it ends, actually, in terms of major improvements.
Of the 130 recommendations listed in the obstacles report, 9 were related to housing. Housing remains a very high priority for people with disabilities.
There's all kinds of people who were forced to live in mental institutions because there was no other accessible accommodation available to them. Thank goodness that's changed.
With regard to housing, a lot of these things were fairly easily corrected, you know, in terms of just putting them in the building code. So, when new buildings were constructed, you know, these various amenities that now we take for granted, you know, they just weren't done at all back then.
When they designed these buildings, if they would take into account the needs of a person with a disability, the amount of additional dollars that would be required to do that is peanuts. But if this building, once it's built, and then they're required to make it accessible, it does. It's very, very expensive to do that. So why not do it in the design of the building?
And we still have buildings that get put up and have to be retrofitted, things like that.
I thought there were building codes that set standards of accessibility.
There are codes. There's codes at every level, federal, provincial, and municipal codes, and they vary, but they're all basically the same. But they're not enforced.
3 people from different parts of the country joined me earlier to discuss their feelings about federal housing initiatives. Paul Thiel currently works at the University of British Columbia. Sean McCormick lives and works in Nova Scotia. He made contributions to the obstacles report. And Marcia Rioux is the executive director of the Rohr Institute in Toronto.
Well, I think one of the major problems has been that most of the funding that's been allocated for people with disabilities in the past has been given to people with disabilities through the housing system, which has meant they haven't had a lot of choices about how they want to live their lives and the ways in which they want to choose to get up every day and work every day and carry out their daily activities.
Well, I think that the issue of location, that a lot of housing units for persons with disabilities, by nature of the fact that the units had to be inexpensive, were often located in unideal areas, away from public transportation, away from shopping, away from some of the major services. I maintain that a lot of credit has to go to specifically to organizations like CMHC, which have, instead of making large amounts of money available, which have created a policy or a philosophical change so that the integration of persons with disabilities in the regular housing market has become good practice, good business practices for developers.
I don't think there's a whole lot of plaudits need to be given out yet in terms of we're on the very early stages of developing a national housing policy. Most housing is developed at the provincial level and managed by the provinces. So across Canada, you have a whole differing degree of housing alternatives to disabled people depending on what province you live in.
Well, I don't think we can forget at this point that there's still 30,000 people who live in institutions in this country where they make no choices on their own. And I think in addition to that, there are thousands more that are living in old age housing units, are living in long-term care hospital facilities, and living in group homes, which many of which look a lot like institutions in the community.
What can we do? What can be done?
Well, my own sense is the most important thing we need to do now is we need to get people their own money, their own resources, financial resources, so they can buy the kinds of support services, the kinds of housing, the kinds of transportation that best suits their lifestyle in a way similar to the rest of Canadians.
Yeah, the issue with housing is the same issue as in many other things, is that until disabled people are employed and capable of earning an income and provided enough support while they're employed to compensate for some of the problems or off their needs, they're never going to be able to get into a point where they can go out and buy housing to meet their needs.
I would certainly agree with Marcia that self-determination in the area of housing, you know, the idea of warehousing people in even in community housing units, as has happened here on the West Coast, is an improvement over institutionalization. But until people can have the means to choose the type of housing and the type of location that best suits their individual needs, then I think we still have a lot of work to do.
Closed captioning on television. It was non-existent. And even where it was existent, the decoding machine was so expensive that the average person with a disability couldn't afford to buy it. Up until, I think, last year, if you had a developmental handicap, you couldn't vote. If you were in an institution, you couldn't vote. If you couldn't get to the polling booth unless you had somebody vote for you on a proxy basis, you couldn't vote. A lot of that changed.
Inclusive schooling has been well established, but only in a small number of school boards and only in one province. That's New Brunswick. It should be illegal for a school to exclude a child with a disability, full stop.
Oh, the committee were so shocked by the living conditions of disabled Aboriginals living on and off reserve that we devoted a special part of the obstacles report to the native population and then did a follow-up report on natives. That population is now caught within numerous jurisdictions. And each one trying to claim that they don't have any responsibility. We still don't have a great improvement in bus service, particularly interprovincial bus service. In the cities, there's been an attempt to provide that system, you know, the handy buses and all that kind of thing, but that whole system is riddled with problems. In the aircraft industry, if you were in a wheelchair and you were a quad and you required a wheelchair with electric battery, for example, if they would let you on the plane in the first place because they were scared that you may be a financial liability to them, if you got past that argument, more often than not they would tell you that they wouldn't take you on the plane on your own. You required an attendant to be with you, because they didn't want to be bothered, you know, providing any particular services that you may need. I think there will still be economic arguments about why they can't do it today, and it will have to wait until better economic times roll around, which I think is unfortunate. And that, see, in transportation, it's not just a question of getting. You can't isolate transportation and say, well, look, you have a problem in transporting someone from point A to point B. It's deeper than that. It's more fundamental than that. If you consider the rate of unemployment that there is within the disabled community, anywhere guesses are, from depending on the group, from 50 to 90% of people who are disabled who are unemployed, can't get jobs.
Employment for people with disabilities, I think, has hardly moved ahead at all, although you do see some efforts to do job coaching with people who are labeled some kind of developmental disability. But I still meet a vast majority of people who are labeled something who are unemployed and consider themselves to be unemployable, which is very sad and difficult to understand, really.
Some require further training. There's all kinds of things, but you can't talk about providing the means for a person with a disability to live independently in society without talking about proper education, proper employment opportunities, proper living conditions, proper transportation to get the person from their apartment or house to the job site. It's all interrelated, and you can't separate one from the other. I think, in my own mind, one is synonymous with the other. If you happen to be in a wheelchair and you're trying to participate in the mainstream of Canadian life, more often than not, you're going to be faced with obstacles that are man-made that prevent you to do so. And it's really quite unfortunate that after, nearly 14 years now, I suppose, since that obstacle report was tabled and its findings were widely acknowledged, that something had to be done to improve these situations. Not much has really changed that much.
I'd like to hark back a little bit to the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which establishes that it's Canadian right, a right of all Canadians to associate freely, in other words, to choose where they live and to choose where they work, and to be able to find employment and to be free from undue incarceration, accepting that they've been proven to be criminal in some way or another. And yet everywhere we see people both with physical disabilities and people with developmental disabilities of a whole variety, and people with mental illness who are still basically living under the control of the service system.
In November of 1990, the federal government agreed to carry out a full review of legislation as it would affect people with disabilities. The following year, organizations representing people with disabilities called for an omnibus bill. It would be designed to address many pieces of legislation. Also that year, the federal government announced a national strategy involving 10 federal departments and agencies. The reaction to that announcement on the part of people with disabilities was mixed. What should be happening now? Our cross-country panel looked at the area of government initiatives.
I think the problem is we continue to have policies and guidelines and soft direction as opposed to having legislation that ensures that persons with disabilities have equal opportunity to housing, transportation, and other amenities that the average Canadian takes for granted.
Well, what kind of legislation or activities should the governments engage in to move this situation forward?
Well, one of the first things I think we need to think about is a national policy. I think we need to get rid of the shame of the way in which we've treated people with disabilities in this country for far too long. The assumption seems to still be that this is a charity issue, not an issue of people living decent, reasonable lives like their fellow citizens. And I think until we have some national leadership which ensures that people can live lives where they make their own choices, lives in which they have some kind of dignity, lives in which their interests and needs in terms of housing, in terms of transportation, in terms of income, in terms of jobs, is taken into account when national policies are being set up, I think we're going to continue to see tinkering and no real change.
I think it's time that we get rid of some of the antiquated legislation that provides for support to disabled people, such as CAP, VRDP, and some other various pieces of legislation. Get rid of them because they're broken, they cannot be fixed. And then we're just tinkering with them all the time, and put in place a National Disability Act.
I think what keeps happening over and over and over again as people look at major legislative changes and as people look at the reform of the Social Security Act, the people who fall off the end are the people with disabilities. Other people get their needs addressed, and people with disabilities get left without their needs addressed. And my fear is that this is going to happen again under the Social Security review that's going on now, and I think we really have to take some strong action to ensure that people with disabilities are front and center on that reform.
What is really required under the circumstances is a very strong push from the disabled community itself. Unfortunately, in my purview, many of the national consumer organizations are getting soft in the belly and somewhat complacent and are claiming, burnout and what have you. But from my point of view, the time couldn't be better because we have a government that has a a prime minister who has a self-avowed disability, a hearing loss due to his facial paralysis. We have the newest member of the disability community, and Monsieur Lucien Bouchard, who unfortunately, and much to all of our regret, has become one of us, and who will be going through the whole process. Now, these are the types of things that the disability community must take advantage of in pressuring the government. It's the environment is right for a kind of a revisit, if you like, into social policy changes that will provide better for people with disabilities.
In 1980, we started out with the idea that there was 80% of persons with disabilities unemployed in this country. We're still looking at 80% of persons with disabilities unemployed in this country and growing. And unless people have the opportunity to earn an income and make decisions themselves, we'll be sitting in the turn of the next century saying the same thing.
Why should you be denied these things simply because you have a disability? I mean, that's the crux. And these things are not going to be resolved unless politicians, the policymakers in particular, have the political will to do it. And I don't think it's going to happen in any of these areas until I think that the Prime Minister establishes a position in the Privy Council office that says, look, it's your responsibility to make sure that anything that comes out of this government has a disabled component within it.
So when you look at what is required, it falls in three areas, basically. One is that people have to be able to be present in the places that make sense to them, whether it's in the schools that make sense to them, or the work environments that make sense to them, or community recreation places, whatever it is, but they have to be present. Secondly, other people have to understand why they're there, right? That they're not there some kind of special program, but they're there as people who are contributing to whatever's going on, just like everybody else, contributing citizens in the community. And then thirdly, we need to have control over whatever specific resources we require in order to be present and participating.
That's our show. We'd like to know what you think about the changes you've noticed or haven't noticed over the last 10 or 20 years. What initiatives do you think the federal government should be pursuing? Write to us. I'm Bill McQueen, and now here's our address. Disability Network, CBC, Box 500, Station A, Toronto, M5W1E6. That's Disability Network, CBC, Box 500, Station A, Toronto, M5W1E6. Or you can fax us at area code 416-205-3399.